Welcome back. I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Terry Casey, who is a licensed psychologist in private practice in Franklin, Tennessee. He comes recommended by Janine Powers from Kappa.
Okay, good morning or afternoon. I'm not sure when you're going to be viewing this. Welcome to Navigating Ethical and Legal Challenges in Counseling. Happy to be here. Appreciate the invitation to be part of your Knoxville Psychiatric Symposium for this year. So we've only got an hour and 15 minutes for this topic, plus I think 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So it's always a challenge to figure out what material to put in and so forth. But just to get us started, let's talk for just a moment about who I'm anticipating will be watching this, and then a little bit about me. Just take a minute or two to do that. Typically, when I'm doing these kinds of trainings, there's sort of almost equal percentages of social workers, psychologists, and LPC, MHSPs, or the equivalent in other states. And then also we usually have some marriage and family therapists as well. So I'm sort of making the assumption that the majority of our audience is one of those four license types. And when I say psychologists, I'm mentally including licensed senior psych examiners here in the state of Tennessee. So that's who I'm assuming I'm talking to. Usually what I do is ask for a show of hands about how many people work in private practice and how many people work here and there. Obviously, we can't do that, so I'm going to be making some assumptions about that as well. So a little bit about me, I'm going to be clicking through the slides. I may make references to slide numbers. If I'm remembering right, I think you're getting a PDF. I'm not totally sure now that I'm saying it, but usually participants get a PDF copy of the slides. So I may reference slide numbers as we go along here. All right, so I'm Terry Casey, licensed psychologist here in Franklin, Tennessee. I'm in private practice. I do see therapy clients. I do clinical supervision, do a fair amount of consultation work. That tends to be with private practices, counseling or mental health organizations, sometimes schools, and sometimes private companies, or even churches on occasion, actually. So that's what I do, but I do a good bit more in the area of teaching and continuing education these days. That's just how things ended. I'm laughing because we were talking a moment ago. Amanda and I were talking, and I mentioned I didn't wake up one day and decide to become the ethics guy. But it has evolved that way, and it seems like it's worked out pretty well. So back to a little bit about my background. I do teach ethical and professional issues in counseling at Lipscomb University's clinical mental health counseling program. I teach 4 sections of that course every year. Been doing that for I think this is year 14 or 15 coming up. So that in addition to that, I also do these continuing ed gigs, if you will, and also through, I won't mention the company name, I don't know if that's okay, but a large continuing ed company that probably most of you would recognize. I will say this, I've worked in a lot of different settings working with minors, adults, inpatient, outpatient, educational settings, hospital settings, a little bit in correctional settings, sort of a pretty good variety. The centerpiece, I guess, of my professional experience, I served as the clinical director at an organization here based out of Nashville called Agape. I was essentially the director of counseling and psychological services there for right at 20 years. And we had, just to give you an idea, around 20 offices scattered across Middle Tennessee, lots of different license types, about 1,200 sessions a month, that kind of thing. So I say that to say this, in that job, I had to become very aware of the different licensing rules, the different codes of ethics, and one thing fed the other in the teaching. And here, and one more bit of information, I did spend, I think it was 5 or 6 years as the ethics chair for a state professional organization And so I'd have people contacting me to do ethics consults. Okay, so moving right along, and I'm going to be moving pretty quickly at times, so I apologize if I get a little bit too sped up, but here's my contact information. By the way, this mobile number, let me point out, that's not for clients. If you want to text me through that number, that's fine. Of course, the email is fine. And here's my address here in Franklin, Tennessee. All right, so we're gonna just start moving into this information. If we had time, I might even ask you if you ever had a good ethics training or a bad ethics training, what made it good or bad. Don't have time for that, but I do want to say my goal is to give you something that's practical, that you can walk out of the room with, that you can start using immediately. And so you'll see what that is as we move along here in just a minute. One of the things I want to stress is this. That I've come to very much to believe that mental health professionals are more likely to attain advanced levels of competence and competence by learning and practicing an effective process of navigating ethical and related dilemmas, as opposed to attempting to learn and remember standards and laws. We all have to do that to some extent, but it doesn't work very well because those things change. And even if you learn some specific information today, and you will, factual information, it might not be for another year and a half, 2, 3 years before you encounter a situation where you need to use that. Well, you've forgotten it by then. You're going to have to be able to look it up and look it up quickly, or have practiced a model of navigating these things, which becomes second nature. And that's really the goal here, as you will see. Learning objectives, you all know what those are and how those work. So I'm going to skip through that. I'm not an attorney. We're going to talk about legal issues. So I want to, that's unavoidable talking about legal issues. We certainly will do that, but I'm not an attorney. I'm not giving legal advice here. Laws vary significantly from one state to the next, and they can change frequently. I would strongly suggest that clinicians obtain continuing education regarding your specific state's laws on a regular basis. There are a number of Tennessee specific trainings available out there. You can contact me if you want more information on that. Legal situations are highly individualized. You realize that. Get legal counsel when needed, and that will be part of the model, as you will see here in just a minute. All right, so we're going to jump right in. Ethical decision making. Let's start with seeing what the major national professional organizations say about this. And in no particular order, the American Psychological Association, they say in the process of making decisions regarding professional behavior, you have to consider, yes, the ethics code, but also applicable laws and regulations. So right off the bat, there's at least 3 pieces to this puzzle, at least, and that's codes of ethics or codes of conduct, applicable laws, there's federal and there's state, and then licensing regulations. So they're sort of shouting that out to us here. This is taken from their preamble, from their code of ethics. ACA says, here's a quote from the ACA's Code of Ethics, 2014. When counselors are faced with ethical dilemmas that are difficult to resolve, you have to pause there and say, aren't all ethical dilemmas difficult to resolve? But when encountering ethical dilemmas that are difficult to resolve, they're expected to engage. Listen to this, you're expected to engage in a carefully considered ethical decision-making process. If you're an LPC of MHSP here in Tennessee, you have to be ready to demonstrate that you have used a carefully considered ethical decision-making process. And it goes on to say, one that can bear public scrutiny. Well, you'll have that, at least the nuts and bolts of it, by the end in the next hour or so. NASW is something very similar. They mentioned it's a process. AAMFT, again, very similar kinds of wording. They're all kind of coming from the same place to put codes of ethics in context. But remember, these are national professional organizations. These aren't legal regulatory bodies. Keep that in mind. So let's go straight to the multiple perspective model. What is the multiple perspective model? This is a model I put together and occasionally make some slight revisions to. Initially put it together probably, let's see, 11 or 12 years ago. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. It's not the only model out there. Frankly, I think it's I think it's effective and it's certainly easy to use. I've gotten a lot of feedback to that effect over the years. So let's dive in and take a look. First thing, in fact, I want to back up one more slide. So I want you to go ahead and take maybe 15 seconds, 15, 20 seconds. I want you to get an actual ethical dilemma, a real life ethical problem, ethically problematic situation in your mind right now. It might be one that you're going through or have gone through. It might be a colleague has gone through it and you were just aware of it. But get a real ethically problematic situation in mind right now. Take a few seconds. Okay, so I want to ask you a question. That ethically problematic situation that you have in mind, right now, is it 100% only purely ethical in nature, meaning that there's no legal aspect to it, there's no clinical or therapeutic aspect to it, there are no policy issues involved, and there are no therapists, the therapists, involved, any of our kinds of issues. The point is this: ethical dilemmas seldom occur in isolation. This is just very, very rare. You almost have to make up a situation for it to be that way. Yes, it could happen, but it's very rare. So just if you had an ethical decision-making model, but it only looks at ethics itself, isolated from everything else, you're not getting the full picture, and you're also not getting a model that addresses real-life kinds of issues. So as a result, the multiple perspective model, and these are the 5 primary perspectives: ethical and legal, you probably guessed that, but also clinical, therapeutic, institutional policies, therapist variables and issues, as I just mentioned a minute ago. So for our training, especially for our training today, we're going to look at ethical and legal, and that's what always takes the most time. I'll spend only a few moments on explaining or discussing the other 3 perspectives. But this is the visual that is probably going to stick in your mind. I hope it sticks in your mind. And so we're going to go through the multiple perspective model pretty quickly, but step by step. And then we will take some time looking at the ethical, do a little bit deeper dive on ethical, on the legal. This is something that a lot of clinicians don't get enough of, and understanding all the legal parts of the legal perspective there are. So we'll spend time on ethical and legal just a tiny bit here. And then in the time remaining, we will look at some vignettes. And these are vignettes that you can use later on as well. Some case vignettes through the lens, through the perspective of this multiple perspective model. So as you can see here, all 5 perspectives have, I always think of this as a table, like a Pentagon-shaped table. They all have equal seating at the table, because that problem that you had in mind a minute ago, that ethically problematic situation, everyone has an ethical aspect to it, or that was what I was asking you to do. But some of you also had a very heavy legal aspect to that situation, and maybe a little bit of clinical therapeutic. Others, it was a little bit of ethical, but as you thought about it, it's more of a policy issue and some therapist variables. You get the idea. Depending on the specific situation, one or more of these perspectives might be more concern or require greater emphasis or focus by us. So this is the starting point. You always want to look at every situation from all 5 perspectives. Don't get tunnel vision just on a code of ethics or legal like licensing rules. You got to look at it from all 5 perspectives rather. So, under ethical, briefly, it's what codes of ethics or codes of conduct. We'll talk about this in a minute. Apply legal. I said this before. Federal, state licensing rules, civil suits, even things like executive orders. I'll mention briefly. Institutional policies. These, if you're in private practices, where your policies for your practice. Yeah, you need to have policies. Therapist variables. This includes things like clinicians' well-being, self-care, interests, awareness of one's values, awareness of your values, self-awareness, and financial interest, even that kind of thing. So let's go ahead to as I said here, let me back up just a second. So step 1 is looking at it from all 5 perspectives. Step 2, the first part, is to look at the ethical principles from the appropriate code of ethics. Now, in the state of Tennessee, this is fairly easy because the state of Tennessee licensing boards have adopted codes of ethics from various national professional organizations. I'm sure all of you are very aware of that. I'm going to use as an example the ACA Code of Ethics and their principles that serve as the foundation for ethical behavior and decision making. So this is the first place you want to check in a code of ethics. Don't rush to look at the standards. Look at these underlying principles first. In this particular case, the ACA code has these underlying principles. And if you take the time to look at the other codes of ethics from national professional organizations, you'll see some significant similarity. That's because there is a common body of research there from which all of these organizations have been pulling when they put these together. So it is critical enough. I want to take a few moments to talk about each one of these. And then you can generalize from here to your specific code of ethics, I think, very easily. So the first one in the ACA code is autonomy. Remember, these are underlying foundational principles for the rest of the code of ethics, the standards, the do this, don't do that kind of standards. Look at these foundational principles first. Autonomy, fostering the right for the client to make decisions and to control the direction of their lives. I will sometimes, if I'm in like a hotel ballroom, I'll have someone stand up with me in the doorway of the ballroom and turn the lights down in the ballroom and make this example or this illustration. For us as clinicians, this will, I think, describe autonomy. And you can use this to describe it to other people who don't really understand what we do. Perhaps you're standing in the doorway, shoulder to shoulder, of this proverbial darkened room. And your client is going to be going into the darkened room and making decisions about what to do in that dark room. Your job, my job, is not to tell the client, when you go into this room, go over to the far corner and sit down for 20 minutes, then walk around in circles or stand on your head or whatever. My job is not to tell them what to do. My job is to illuminate the room and point out things that they might not realize or observe. So it's like I've got a flashlight and I'm going to shine it around, illuminate this darkened room. But make no mistake, clients make their own decisions about their lives. That's autonomy. Non-maleficence, avoid doing harm. Well, that seems straightforward enough, doesn't it? Well, except that these are principles and they all have a degree of subjectivity to them. Certainly, we don't want to damage our clients. However, if we were in a room, I might ask, how many of you have said something to a client in the past year, expecting full well it was going to make them very uncomfortable? Well, that usually goes along with doing therapy at some point, or at least often does, right? So there's a client might report, this makes me so uncomfortable. This hurts for me to think and talk and deal with this. But we can't damage them. We can't harm them, obviously. So this is one of those things that takes skill, and I think experience, of course, helps a lot as well to make sure we don't cross that line to actually harming our clients. Beneficence, working for the good of the client. But look, If you're an LPC, MHSP in Tennessee, this is your code of ethics. Your code of ethics says you are to work for the good of not just the client, but society at large. Okay, think about that. So if we were to do a survey, how many of us are going to, for example, agree about solutions to the top 10 social issues in our country at this moment in time? We're not all going to agree. That's certainly not going to happen. Nevertheless, this code of ethics says you should work for the good of client and society at large. It's subjective. It's an aspirational goal. It's a foundational underpinning for the rest of the code of ethics. Justice, treating clients equitably. Notice it doesn't say treating clients exactly the same. If we were able to discuss things, we could get some examples very quickly of two different clients that some of you have had, and you could not treat this one the way you treat that one. You can't interact with them the same way. A very obvious example is if you have a 6-year-old child as a client, you can't interact with them the same way you would with a 60-year-old, and so forth. But being equitable, fostering fairness and equality. Next, fidelity, honoring commitments, fulfilling responsibilities of trust. And this goes on to say, regarding everyone with whom in this case, the counselor has professional contact. The point I want to make here, beyond the obvious, is that our professional relationships are not limited to clinician and client or patient. We have supervisory relationships. We have educational relationships that are professional relationships. We have collegial relationships. We have relationships with parents of our minor age clients and patients, and so forth. So, honoring commitments, not just with clients and patients, but all these other types of relationships as well. Veracity, dealing truthfully with clients and others. Have you ever I'm going to raise my hand. I usually ask this question, have you ever intentionally told a client something that wasn't the truth? Yes. Now, I've got a little story that goes with that. I won't go into great detail. I'll just say the client was pounding on the window of my car, and I decided to tell her I had called the police. I had not called the police yet. It wasn't necessary, as it turns out, but I wasn't exactly truthful to her. It seemed like the thing to do. Didn't know at that moment if she was going to be a physical threat to me or others standing around. So, underlying principles. Step 2A, you got to look at these principles. People forget to do this. They skim over it. Now, let me give you a sort of a recommendation. If you are looking in the standards, it's the next slide. If you're looking in the standards, that's the do this, don't do that section of your code of ethics or code of conduct. If you don't find the issue that you're concerned about being addressed there, turn around and go back to the underlying principles, right? Turn around and go back to this and use this and document this as a basis for the decision that you're making. All right, so start here, then go to the standards and do a thorough search, as I'll say in just a moment here. And then if you don't find anything, go back to the foundational principles and base your decision on that. Now, for these ethical standards, it's pretty straightforward. We've all delved into our codes of ethics, respectively, and seen what's in there and refer to them from time to time. But here's a word of caution right here. Don't stop your search after you find one applicable standard. There may be additional relevant standards, clarifications, or exceptions elsewhere in the code. For example, let's say you were looking up a particular issue regarding clients. You can take your pick, and you do a search. You get the PDF of your code of ethics, and you search for that term, and you find one instance of it in your code of ethics in standard B3E or whatever. You find it there, and you're done, right? No, you're not done. You're not done. Here's why. Because codes of ethics, licensing rules, and many kinds of legal documents, Hipaa, for instance, just to name one, right? Here's what happens. You can find an instance of what you're looking for But unless you do a thorough search and use other similar terms, what you won't know is that later on in that same document, there's an exception to the initial rule. This happens all the time. So they don't tell you at the place in the standards where the rule, it says, here's the rule or here's the thing to do or not do. They don't tell you, hey, by the way, look over in another section because there's an exception there or a clarification. And then sometimes in a further section later on in the document, there's a clarification to the exception to the original rule or standard. So do a thorough search. This is what we pay attorneys for a lot of times because they know, presumably, how to search legal documents and why that's necessary. All right, so that's step 2B. Look at the standards. Step 3, does the problem have a significant legal component? All I'm going to say about this here, because we're going to delve into this a little more. Federal laws, state laws, licensing rules, state executive orders. I've added that in recently because it's relevant. And then civil suits and so forth. We don't have time to delve into all those in a great deal, but I'm going to mention them. So we're going to kind of skim the wave tops of these areas. But here is sort of the stair step of what to review, what to look at under step 3 to see if there's a legal component to what you're talking about, to the issuing of concern. Step 4, consultation. Every decision-making model you'll ever see has a consultation piece to it, as it should. Mine is just a tiny bit, a little bit different. If you look at step 4, point B here, well, A, first, consult with your close associates and colleagues, of course. We're going to do that. We all do that. But also, B, consult with other counseling or mental health professionals who will be likely to provide objective opinions. Our colleagues and friends might not be objective. And this is a situation where you need objectivity. Where can you find these people? Well, these individuals can be found in state professional organizations, national professional organizations. Sometimes people in private practice provide consultation services, obviously, as well. And then you may need to consult with others, for instance, attorneys. And that's basically step 4. Step 5, this is the last step. Make a decision, and you list the following: who, what, where, when, sure. You might even put a very brief narrative, but if you do put a narrative describing the situation, avoid including unnecessary or irrelevant information. Don't put anything in there that's not directly germane to your final decision that you're going to make below. Step C, here's the big part. This is arguably the most important part of the model. Document your process and your sources of information used for making the decision. This is like showing your work. You remember in algebra when you were back in school many years ago, you're sitting and you're doing algebra problems. If you showed your work, at least in my day, if you showed your work, you get credit for that, even if you missed a little bit on the final answer. So what you want to do here is document what sources you used, for instance. And first of all, let me say this first. First of all, document that you used a decision-making model. If you stopped right there, you will have done more than most people whose names come before the licensing board by far. So do yourself a favor. Use some sort of decision-making model that you can cite or reference. Don't use the model you made up in the shower this morning, but use one that's been out there, has been in use, and you can cite it. Then cite or quote definitions, sections from the applicable federal and state laws. Cite them in your decision. Cite or quote relevant sections from your licensing rules. And as you might have guessed, down here at the bottom, cite or quote relevant ethical principles and standards from the applicable Code of Ethics. And at the very end of this process, you're also going to document consultations that you had with colleagues. Make sure they knew it was a consultation. They're okay with you documenting what they said. Always check with them. But you document the consultations, then you describe your decision and any follow-up steps, signed and dated. That, in a nutshell, that's the short version of the model. It's just 5 steps. And if you use that framework, I've seen it used for many years at several different places. And it seems to hold up over time and be something that everybody can kind of sink their teeth into and learn and use as a framework, not only for dealing with actual problems when they come up, but as a way of thinking about things in the moment. So you can, when you start to think on your feet using this model, then now you're ahead of the game and you can start avoiding problems you might not have otherwise avoided. All right, so let's go on. The 5 perspectives. As I said, we're only going to look at ethical and legal closely. Ethical perspective. Sources of ethics. There are 4 sources of codes of ethics. Number 1 is the one we're dealing with in our state, and that is formal adoption of a professional organization's code of ethics, like the NASW, APA, ACA, AMFT, as indicated over here. Now I'm going to go ahead and mention these other 3 briefly. Number 2, some states, some licensing boards develop their own codes of ethics. These are frequently called codes of conduct or something similar. And they are sometimes embedded directly into the licensing rules. So you have to go search for it. Depends on the state. I've done state-specific trainings in something over 25 states, half the states in the country, and researched different ways that licensing boards do this. And it's kind of all over the place. But it's a very popular thing to do. But that's not here in our state, so we're not going to spend much time on it. Number 3, by the way, can be a hybrid of 1 and 2. That is, a state licensing board may say, we're going to take parts of a professional organization's codes of ethics and use it or point to it, but we're also going to add in some things or take some things out. And then the 4th one is what I just call referencing a non-specific code of ethics. There are a few states that say, officially to the license holder, use the code of ethics that is the prevalent or recognized code of ethics in your profession. Pretty vague, but they have some reasons for doing it that way. So we're going to focus on number 1 because this really bears our attention. Formal adoption. So if we're going to talk about this formal adoption of a professional organization's code of ethics, we have to take time to understand what professional organizations really are and what they are not. First of all, in bold here, as you can see, national professional organizations exist primarily to promote and advocate for their respective professions. And you're not going to see, for instance, the APA advocating for professional counselors or vice versa. That just doesn't, it's all siloed within their professions. I've got a comment here. Let's see. Note, as you can see here, note that this is in contrast to the primary missions of licensing boards, which is to protect the public. 2 very different missions of national professional organizations versus licensing boards. However, licensing boards in this case have chosen to reach over to a professional organization and take their code of ethics and insert it into use by license holders or those working toward license. So 2 different kinds of organizations, but this organization is borrowing a code of ethics from that one. So how does that work out? Well, pretty well. I would liken it to having a size 9 foot and a size 11 shoe. You can walk around in it. It'll get the job done, but it doesn't fit perfectly. And we shouldn't expect it to fit perfectly. But on the whole, it works pretty well. And many states do that, including Tennessee. So let's go on to the next one. I took a little bit of extra time just to sort of emphasize the difference between national professional organizations and state licensing boards. Their missions here we just talked about, very different. I'm sure you all realize this, but just as a reminder, professional organizations don't have any legal authority, but they can be influential. Why? Well, as we'll see, when you're over here in a licensing board, if they're looking to add a new counseling regulation or change one, and it's some new issue, maybe that's something to do with technology, which happens a lot. Where might they go to kind of get the current lay of the land? They might look at what the national professional organizations have already done on that issue or topic and start with that. They may or may not line up ultimately with what that organization says, but that information is available, so they're certainly not going to ignore it. And oftentimes, they'll have direct relevance to what the licensing board ends up doing. So that's this idea that professional organizations, they do have indirect influence. All right, so let's move on. So still with this source one, that is formal adoption of codes of ethics. Remember that these organizations' codes of ethics reflect the values and agendas of the organization. Well, of course they do. It's their organization. They have their own mission. They have their own vision. They have their own things that they're involved in. And so it's necessarily going to reflect that. And remember that this is their codes of ethics are developed by their own members, and it really applies only to their members. These codes of ethics are not written directly for use by licensing boards. Licensing boards do that as a convenience because it's sitting there ready to go. All right. Let's see. Let's go ahead to, let's skip down. Yes, I want to give you just a sampling of the purpose statements and missions from national professional organizations. You can pick yours out and read here. Let's see. Let's take a look at the NASW. They're founded back in 55. Some interesting. I think they've got over 130,000 members. But here's the statement. NASW works to enhance the professional growth and development of its members and to create and maintain professional standards. But they can't enforce them. They can only enforce it on their members and to advance sound social policies. You'll see very similar, say with the APA, what their mission is. You get the idea. So keep that perspective. Now, that source number two mentioned, developed by the state, sometimes called codes of conduct and hybrids. And here's that source number four, referencing a non-specific code of ethics. The wording here is a code of ethics that is considered to be the standard. Now, if you were a professional counselor, would that be the NBCC's code of ethics or the ACA's or some other? Don't know. So here's the point I'll make. If you were to find yourself in that kind of situation where the licensing rules or laws don't give you clearly specific instructions, then settle on doing what you're going to do and make it policy. I've got another example of that coming up later on. But in this case, if you were in one of these states and you're in private practice, you might want to say, all right, I'm going to make it policy that I follow the ACA code of ethics. Now you've kind of locked yourself in, but you've stated you're going to use that as a guide in your professional behavior. All right. So these components mention the preambles and fundamental principles. Here they are. Again, this, like I said, this is just hearkening back to what's specifically mentioned in the model. So we don't need to cover that again. Here, the standards do this, don't do that. And they look like this. Now, one other thing I didn't mention yet, some codes of ethics, certainly some codes of ethics, but also licensing rules and other kinds of documents. For example, many of you out there wrote a thesis and or a dissertation. In doing that, you had to define your terms. And however you define term X in your dissertation, that's what it meant. That was the definition of term X for your dissertation. Doesn't matter what other people want it to mean or whatever, you can define it however you want to. So the same thing applies here. These specific terms, using the language, what I'm saying is you want to use the language that is used by the Code of Ethics or the licensing rules. Use their definitions. Why is this important? Well, it's confusing. It's confusing not It's confusing to the public potentially, but it's also confusing to us as providers. Here's why. Let me give you a very basic example I use with my students. When is an hour not an hour? Well, when your licensing rules define it as a client contact hour, which is 50 minutes in the licensing rules for professional counselors, at least. So terms don't always mean the same thing. Here's another example. And terms, by the way, can vary within a state from one license type to another, and they can vary from state to state for the same license type. For example, I'm thinking of a state right now that uses, if you're in that state, if you use the word intern or internship, what it refers to is postmasters or postgraduate program. You've already graduated. Now you're working toward licensure. They call that an internship. Well, that's not what an internship here is here in this state. And in most states, an internship is a course that you take as part of your graduate program or a series of courses even, and then you graduate after the fact. So even something like intern or internship gets used differently. I could give you a bunch of other terms as well. Define your terms. Go to the glossary. And one general recommendation I'll go ahead and make, but I'll point to it later. The vast majority of us are required to follow HIPAA. Well, use HIPAA language. Use HIPAA language. You can always point to where you got that definition from, and federal law is usually a good way to go on that. All right, so here are these stair steps that I mentioned before, these different levels of the law. Start with federal. So here's federal. Now, this isn't a HIPAA training. This is far from sufficient to be a HIPAA training. As I'm sure everybody knows, it stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Yes, that's what it stands for. It's not health information or any other various terms. It's health insurance, strangely. Portability and Accountability Act. This law, and similar to FERPA and something called 42 CFR, these federal laws all have to do with the privacy and the security of private information for people that receive health care, or in the case of FERPA, educational services. It's all about individuals' privacy, about their information and their identity and so forth. Not jurisdiction. These laws do not determine jurisdiction. There's a good bit of confusion about that out right now. So HIPAA, if you have to follow HIPAA, well, we'll see in just a moment. If you're a covered entity, then you have to follow HIPAA. FERPA, Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, sort of similar to HIPAA. It's like a different planet in the same solar system. Gravity is a little bit different. Atmosphere is a little bit different, but it's a planet. And this has to do with the privacy of students' personally identifiable information. By the way, that applies to all educational institutions that receive federal funding. So if you work at a counseling center, it's at a university, those counseling records are educational records, and they must be handled according to FERPA, not HIPAA. Now, you might go to your private practice in the evening and see clients and do the same thing there you did during the day at the University Counseling Center, but your private practice records are almost certainly going to have to follow HIPAA, only with rare exception. 42 CFR, this has to do with, as it says here, this applies to any individual entity that's federally assisted, funded, and holds itself out as providing and provides alcohol or drug abuse diagnosis, treatment, or referral for treatment. So if you work in an entity that meets this description here, then your client records, your patient records, have to follow 42 CFR Part 2 in addition to HIPAA. 2 levels of this. We're going to focus on HIPAA because that's what is common to probably everybody present today. So HIPAA, there's 3 rules I want to make you aware of. There's actually a couple of other rules, but these 3 rules are the main ones for us to lay out today. Privacy rule, security rule, breach notification rule. If you want a good, concise summary, here's your good link for this. By the way, what I've tried to do in the training here is give you links to sources that I've researched and kept in the materials that I have, sometimes for a good bit of time. So there's a lot of links here that are in here for a purpose, not just to document that the privacy rule exists. Go to this. This is a primary source. HHS, that's Health and Human Services. These are the primary sources. Save yourself a lot of time, perhaps, by using these links. All right, so these are the 3 rules. We're not going to do a deep dive. Can't do that this morning. However, I do want to point out these resources here. Here's a great starting place for HIPAA for professionals. It even says that here, HIPAA for professionals. This is Health and Human Services. Use this link. You can kind of go to that page and spread out from there into hundreds of other pages related to HIPAA. Some of those are listed here. Here's something called the HIPAA notice. I look to my right. My HIPAA notice is hanging on my wall in my office to the right. If your office doesn't have the HIPAA notice posted, you are out of compliance with HIPAA. PHI, protected health information, basically self-explanatory. Business associates, we're going to talk about this in business associate agreements. Here's a resource for HIPAA and COVID, and you get the idea right on down. And a really good one I like to always point out, Psychotherapy Notes. If you're not familiar with Psychotherapy Notes, then it's like having a great tool in your toolbox that you've never used once. It's a great tool to have and be aware of. It's allowed by federal law. These are not progress notes. These are not case notes. They're psychotherapy notes. They are your notes. Clients can't get them unless they have an actual court order. All right. So, do you have to be HIPAA compliant? Almost certainly. Almost certainly you and I are covered entities. So, covered entities, there's 3 types. Healthcare providers, that's us. Health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, we're not really going to discuss that. And providers are, as you can see here. But look at this note. These providers, say psychologists, are only covered entities if they transmit any information in an electronic form in connection with a transaction for which HHS has adopted standard. What that means is the day that you first transmitted any protected health information electronically, you became a covered entity. If it was 10 years ago, it happened then. If it was yesterday afternoon, it happened then. So almost all healthcare providers are going to be covered entities. And that's what everybody sort of expects anyway, in terms of a standard of practice, I would argue. So let's take a look at this. Let's say you're not a covered entity. Say you're sitting there right now, you're saying, I've never used any electronics at all in my practice. It's totally paper-based. I've got this documented. There's no evidence I've never done it. Okay. However, be careful here. Let me mention a few of these bullet points. My suggestion would be that you opt to be HIPAA compliant. Make it policy, even if you don't technically have to be, which is very unlikely. I already mentioned you become a covered entity when you transmit any protected health information electronically. Nearly everybody's done this. HIPAA compliance can be argued as being essentially the standard of care. That perception itself can result in a hassle factor that's quite high for you. So if you are viewed as not meeting the standard of care, the way things are done, you're going to look bad, say in a civil suit, in a courtroom. You could even conceivably lose your case because you're judged to not be doing what the standard is. So I'm just saying it's better to be HIPAA compliant. It's not that hard anymore. Back in the early days, it was much harder to figure out how to do all that. So let's move on. Assuming you're a covered entity, we also want to talk about business associates. What's a business associate? This is a HIPAA term. If you're not familiar with this, you need to be. A business associate, there's 2 descriptions I pulled from HHS here. One is a person or entity that performs certain functions or activities that involve the use or disclosure of protected health information on behalf of or provide services to a covered entity. A member of the covered entity's workforce is not a business associate. So if you hire someone to work in the front office of your practice, that person is not a business associate. Let me go to the second description, which I think gets more to the point. A business associate is a person or entity of some sort, company, organization, other than a member of the workforce of a covered entity who performs functions or activities on behalf of or provides certain services to a covered entity that involve access to the businesses by the business associate to protected health information. Let me give you an example. A perfect example would be if you're in private practice and you outsource your insurance billing. Well, the person or company that you outsource that to, they have to access your client's protected health information, their name, their social security number, their diagnosis, CPT codes. All that is PHI. All that is protected health information. So I, as a covered entity, have to have a business associate agreement with that company or entity that does the insurance billing. So, but you want to do this. Why? Because as a business associate, in this case, an individual that bills insurance, that person now inherits the lion's share of the liability. They have to be HIPAA compliant as a business associate. So you want to have a business associate agreement with them, and you want to make sure that they are very familiar with that on the front end and used to doing that kind of thing. If they're not, you might want to shop around. By the way, this would apply to practice management systems that you might subscribe to and a variety of other situations. Here's an example of a situation where the person involved would not have to be a business associate. Let's say you have someone that comes in and cleans your office. They have access to your office, but their job does not entail handling protected health information. In that case, they're not required to be a business associate. Should they come across any protected health information, HHS considers that incidental contact. And of course, it shouldn't happen. You should have it blocked up. All right, so moving ahead with HIPAA itself, I want to play this recording to save my voice. I wanted to boil this down to just 5 steps here that are at the heart of HIPAA for providers. So listen to this. You might need to turn the volume up on your device, possibly. Here we go. A note about HIPAA compliance. A healthcare provider becomes a covered entity, a HIPAA term, if a provider has transmitted any client or patient EPHI, electronic protected health information. All covered entities must be HIPAA compliant. It is important to understand that HIPAA compliance is a process which involves, but is not limited to, the following steps. Step 1, conduct a risk analysis regarding clients or patients' PHI. Step 2, develop methods to mitigate the identified risks. Step 3, implement the risk mitigation methods, including new policies and procedures. Step 4, regularly review the effectiveness of the risk mitigation methods. And step 5, identify new risks and change or add risk mitigation methods as needed. Okay, so that's what you need to be thinking about on an ongoing basis for your practice or organization about being HIPAA compliant. All right, Ferpa, we're not going to spend too much time on this. Let me skip down to how do you determine if counseling records must be handled, maintained, transmitted according to HIPAA versus Ferpa? Well, here's a quote from HHS here, which we can read, but it really comes down to this. The first and most important question to ask is, who owns and maintains the records? If it's an institution, educational institution that receives any federal funding, they own the records, the counseling records at a university counseling center, for instance, then FERPA applies. If it's a healthcare provider who's a covered entity, then HIPAA applies. Now, it gets confusing when you have someone, say a community mental health center is providing services on the grounds of a public school. So you've got a healthcare provider providing services on site at an educational institution, but it goes back to who owns the records. If the community mental health center owns the records, those counseling records for those students are kept according to Hipaa. If the school system owns the records, then they're under Ferpa. I've even got some more information about this. You can read this on your own if you're in that situation and need more clarification. I've even got right here. Here's a little Hipaa quiz. Let me just do one of these. Let's skip down. Client counseling records when a public school contracts with the community mental health center. That's what I was just saying, to provide part-time counselors. But listen to this difference. In this case, the community mental health center is being asked to come and supplement the school's own counselors. So the school has a counseling center, the school has counseling records, someone from the outside is coming in, contracting with the school to provide counseling services, but the records are owned by the school and therefore are kept maintained according to Ferpa, not Hipaa. Not Hipaa. All right. State laws. There's all kinds of state laws. Here are some of the ones that come into play in our practice, our professional activities on a regular basis. Mandatory reporting suspected abuse of vulnerable adults. This got bumped down somehow. Mandatory reporting of suspected abuse of children, of minors. Everyone in the state of Tennessee is a mandated reporter. That's not the case in every state. Duty to warn and protect, for instance, age for clients to give consent for their own treatment. That in general, at age 16, an individual in Tennessee can provide consent for their own mental health treatment. Again, you need to know the specifics on that if you work with minors or your organization does. Access to minors' records. There's some obvious things here. Parents generally have access to their child's records. That's not always the case. However, here's the one that gets missed a lot of times. Let's say you're working with a minor and the parents are divorced and only one parent has the legal right to provide consent. The fact that that one parent has the right to provide legal consent does not take away the right of the other parent to access the child's records. And most parents don't know this. They're not going to understand this. You're going to have to point that out to them so they know it on the front end. That other parent who has no legal right to provide consent for the child's treatment still, in the vast majority of circumstances, has access to the child's records. Remember, Tennessee, if your client or client's personal representative requests a copy of the records, you have an option. Look in your licensing rules. You have an option to provide a summary rather than a complete copy. It's in your licensing rules, in most cases, in a section called Mandatory Release of Client Records. But read it. Read it. That's another tool for your toolbox if you're not aware of it. It's in there and available to you. Licensing rules and regulations, I've said this before, these vary dramatically from state to state, profession to profession. Now, how to think like a licensing board. This is a resource I don't normally give out, but to be honest, I've been putting together an advanced practice ethics training, and I've started to really appreciate these sources. These are licensing board associations. In other words, licensing boards from all the states and U.S. territories, in some cases Canadian provinces, they have their own organization, their own professional organizations. And here they are. Here's the four main ones. Well, they have websites, and they have a ton of excellent information on their websites. What better source to base your policies or decision-making on than something that these associations of licensing boards say in their own materials? So take a look at these. These are great resources. I wish we had more time to explore that today. Scope of practice versus competence. What I want to highlight here, let me go back. This is a situation where terms get confused again. Scope of practice and competence is not the same. In short, it comes down to this. The state establishes the range for scope of practice, and the license holder is responsible for making responsible judgments regarding his or her professional competence. Here's a little diagram. So the green circle here is the scope of practice. Scope of practice always goes along with a type of license. It doesn't speak to an individual, it speaks to a license type. So as a licensed psychologist, I have to operate within my scope of practice. And I also have to operate within my competencies, represented by these blue ovals here. If I were to have, let's say I was competent to prescribe psychotropic medication, well, it doesn't fall within my license, within my scope of practice. I can't do it legally, obviously. So competency is very different. Another example would be, my youngest daughter and I, we have the same driver's license, which, by the way, think about the parallel here. Driver's license exists to do what? Protect the public. That whole licensing process, very similar to our licensing processes. However, certain drivers, as we all know, have different sets of competencies. My daughter she's a good driver, but she's not competent to drive a 6-speed manual transmission in rush hour traffic in Nashville, Tennessee, in bad weather at night. She's just not. And she knows that. And she's not going to do that, I hope. She's actually at UTK right now. So if anyone sees her driving erratically, I hope that doesn't happen. So competencies versus scope of practice. I say this, but this is the kind of thing where the licensing boards live and breathe. They want you to be able to demonstrate that you're competent and you're operating only within your scope of practice, of course. Now, actions licensing boards can take. I pulled these from licensing rules for professional counselors, but these are very similar from what I've seen to other license types, even in other states. Here's the first one. In this state, it's called an advisory censure. This is the equivalent. I'll stick with the driving metaphor. This is the equivalent of me leaving here and driving down I-65 and getting pulled over by a state trooper. And the trooper comes to my window and I say, hi, what's the problem? And the trooper advises me that my license plate is expired or something and gives me an informal warning. Hey, go take care of that. Okay, good. That's what this is. It's an advisory censure. It is the letter. It comes in the form of a letter, but it's informal and advisory, and it's not a formal disciplinary action. So if you were to get one of these and you're asked in the licensing process in another state, or when you're getting professional liability insurance or getting hired at a job or something, and they ask you, have you ever had formal disciplinary action taken? You can say no. This does not constitute formal disciplinary action. The others do. Formal censure or reprimand is like getting a minor speeding ticket or parking ticket, I guess. If you don't get all your CEUs in, I think it's a $500 fine for at least for LPCMHSPs in this state. Probation, just what it sounds like. Your license is just like a driver's license, suspended or not suspended. It's you better stay between the lines and under the speed limit. Do everything just right for a protracted period of time. Then it gets really serious. License suspension, license revocation. Does this actually happen? It does. Unfortunately, I walked into a coffee shop a few years back, walked up to the counter, and I looked up behind the counter was Dr. So-and-so. She looked at me, I looked at her. She kind of said, yeah. She had decided to take some risks and got into a business relationship with a client. It went sour, and the client reported her to the licensing board. They revoked her license. I don't know if she ever got it back. They revoked it, and 6 years of graduate school. Not a good day. Not a good day for anybody. Other legal things to think about: civil suits. Very briefly, if you find yourself in a civil suit, for the plaintiff to prevail, they have to show that you had a duty in the first place. You have to show that you breached your duty. And here's the tough one. They have to show what's called proximate cause. That is, your action or inaction was directly linked to the damage or harm that was occurred. That's not so easy. And then the harm and damages have to be substantiated, have to be demonstrated as well. Criminal prosecution in an increasing number of states, if you have, even if it's consensual sex with an adult age client, it's criminal behavior. They will come and arrest you. And again, that's not a good day, and of course can be avoided. I mentioned executive orders. I don't have a slide for that, not in this presentation, but remember, executive orders are issued by a governor of a state, and they have the effect of law, usually for a temporary period of time. And there's certain limitations on them, but there are executive orders, as most of us know, regarding COVID-related issues and who can practice across state lines into two people who are in Tennessee. That's another issue altogether. Risk in general. It's like walking across a frozen lake. You're taking chances you don't really know, but people do walk across lakes. Our perceptions of risk are not the same as real risk. Let's keep that in mind. So it's best, if you're going to walk across a frozen lake, maybe walk within arm's length of the bank, because the first time you break through the ice may be the last thing you did. Now, in conjunction with that comment, I want to say this: individuals we view as risk takers, they're not necessarily unknowledgeable or foolish. Sometimes they're akin to explorers that blaze trails for the rest of us and are later deemed to kind of be heroes. However, on other occasions, they're never heard from again because they broke through the proverbial or maybe literal ice. We're never seen. So those are the two main perspectives. The third is clinical therapeutic. You always want to watch for this. This affects things dramatically. Any clinical or therapeutic issue like you see here, treatment planning, diagnosis, etc., that's what you want to look for and take into consideration from perspective 3. 4, institutional policies. Pretty straightforward here, but what are the policies that come into play from all these different kinds of settings or employers? By the way, if you work for the VA, you're in a closed federal system. And in some cases, state laws or licensing rules don't actually apply in the same way. But so institutional policies. And last, therapist variables and issues, things like your personal safety, your self-care, whether it's physical or emotional self-care, financial interests, and so forth. Be aware of these things. Now, so if you take these 5 perspectives, when we get into the vignettes, so we don't have much time to do that, but you'll be able to do it on your own if you want to. You look at the vignettes, which come up next here, and I'll just take this first one. I'm just going to play this vignette. I'm going to make a couple of comments about it, and then we will move on and see how many of these vignettes we can work in briefly. So here's the first vignette. Remember, the purpose here is not to come up with the perfect answer. What I would suggest is you just try to apply the multiple perspective model. If nothing else, look at this vignette as it's being played. Think about it from those 5 perspectives: ethical, legal, clinical, therapeutic, policies, and therapist issues as well. Here we go. Here's the recording.
Liam recently graduated with a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling and is now working toward licensure as an employee at a nonprofit counseling agency. One of Liam's responsibilities is to conduct phone screening interviews with potential clients who are seeking counseling services. One caller, a 25-year-old mother of a 7-year-old girl, blurts out to Liam that her 21-year-old live-in boyfriend has been touching her daughter in clearly sexually inappropriate ways. The mother tells Liam this before Liam has a chance to tell the caller about the limits of confidentiality.
And by the way, that's 7. I think if you have materials of this, I think it may say something different than 7. But that also highlights the thing that you can do with these vignettes is switch variables around and work through the model a second time. But let's take a look at this specific vignette and let's think about ethical, legal, at least those 2, clinical, therapeutic. So one thing that jumps out at us here is a state law about mandated reporting child abuse. So there's a state law, there's a legal issue from the legal perspective right off the bat. What about confidentiality here? That's embedded in this situation. Confidentiality is an ethical issue. Privacy is a legal issue. They're similar, but confidentiality, who do we extend confidentiality to? Sometimes in discussing this vignette, the question comes up, is there a client here? Well, from a strictly legal perspective, the answer is no, because no one has signed informed consent document. However, from an ethical perspective, as soon as someone contacts us for services, we extend the ethical right of confidentiality to them at first contact. And it kind of has to work that way, doesn't it? Otherwise, people wouldn't tell us what's going on until they had an ironclad signed agreement that we're not going to say anything. So from a clinical standpoint, from an ethical standpoint, there's a confidentiality issue here. It so happens that this is going to be an exception to confidentiality, which presumably the caller, may not know about, or maybe they do. We don't know that, do we? By the way, yes.
We have just 5 minutes left.
Okay. All right. So I'll finish up talking about this one. I'll point to a couple of strategic strategies at the end, and then we'll go to Q&A. So the point is, take each one of these vignettes, look at it from ethical, confidentiality issues related here, legal, state law to report suspected child abuse, clinical. Well, clinical therapeutic. This contact is, I would argue, the first baby step in a therapeutic relationship. I think that makes it into the clinical perspective right there. There certainly are policies probably at this nonprofit agency that come into play, and there might be things pertaining to Liam. Liam doesn't have much experience yet. We could talk about that. So what I've done for you, there's some discussion questions after each one of these vignettes. Here's a good one about a client in a bind in multiple relationships, a client that's considering going in house sitting, dog sitting for her client. And the coffee shop, I wish we could do this one live. This is fun to do live. And another one about testimonials and a whole bunch of different things piled into one. So the last section in materials are these suggestions for avoiding problems and reducing risk. I'm not going to read through these, but I do just want to point out a few. Have a model, have an effective decision-making model, and practice using it. If you're working with a minor, always establish and document the status of the minor's parents' relationship before you take the case on. Here's something you may not think about. Use other professions' codes of ethics informationally. These are great sources of information to give you ideas and even wording and terminology, perhaps, for your policy making and for making decisions. So don't forget, there's other good information, even though it may not be in your specific profession, you may not have to follow it. It's still out there and available to you. Who is the client? Document who's the client. Very basic. Sometimes people forget to do that. Several others here. I want to skip down. Here are those. I just love these resources, these national, these organizations of licensing boards. You can read the rest of these for yourself. If you don't have a practice management system, well, this is a great time to get a practice management system. I would recommend it. They're certainly worth it in so many ways. The last things are, here's this wording about providing a summary of records instead of a copy. And Psychotherapy Notes, as I mentioned before, a valuable but underutilized tool out there. So we have, by my clock here, we have finished up with this part of the presentation. And so we're going to kick it back to Amanda, or Janine rather, for the Q&A session.
Yes. Hey, Terry, that was great. And I'm thinking it might be most useful for us to go through one or two of those vignettes rather than me asking specific questions.
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
You want me to? I'll back up to one of those.
Right, and maybe I don't know if you can pull up side by side, or maybe we can flip back and forth to the
Yeah, the model. I don't have a way of doing that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
PowerPoint if there is a way to do that, that's beyond my
Right. I don't know.
knowledge of how to do that. But remember, it's that Pentagon-shaped model, the 5 perspectives, and then you work through it. And I've given it to you in a pretty brief form.
Sure.
This is a great kind of thing to do these vignettes with in staff meetings once a month or once a quarter. I'll add in, this is just anecdotal evidence, but when I was working for that agency for 20 years, we had our whole counseling staff, which is about 30 people. We would break into small groups and do vignettes with this model. In 20 years, we were never sued once. We were never sued once. We only had three complaints filed with licensing boards, and they were all immediately dismissed.
Great. Well, I like the simplicity and the concrete.
Yeah,
The points that they're easy to follow. They give you great resources.
So here's the second vignette: client in a bind. Kendra, well, I'm going to save my voice. So let me play the recording if that's okay.
Sure.
Kendra is a second-year master's student in a clinical mental health counseling program. She recently began an internship which involves providing counseling to children and adolescents. The mother of one of her child clients has been going through several difficulties recently and is struggling to handle the multiple stressors in her life. After one of her daughter's counseling appointments, the mother tells Kendra that she and her daughter must leave town for 2 weeks to take care of some family issues. She says that she's in a bind because she has no one to take care of her 2 dogs or her house during her absence. She offers to pay Kendra generously to house sit, dog sit while she is away.
All right, so for the participants for this, I don't anticipate that you're a master's student. You're the supervisor or the director, and there's going to be a knock at your door by Kendra. Okay?
Right.
You're right. That's what's going to happen. And it may be a very tentative knock because she's hoping you're not there or whatever. All right. So think about it from the ethical perspective here, Janine. Do you see an ethical or a legal component here? Well, usually when we talk about ethics with this one, people start focusing on multiple relationships.
Sure.
Yeah. Does Kendra really want to be hired by her client, her minor age client's mom? What's more, going to their house and being in their house blurs boundaries. That's the whole point of multiple relationships being something we generally want to avoid in general. So if she were to take this job, think what could happen. Yes, the dogs could die, the dogs could run away, the house could burn down. She could find heaven forbid, a meth lab in the basement. She could find mom's psychotropic meds or what. There's all kinds of things. And now she's got information she never would have had and shouldn't have. Now she's got another dilemma. But she didn't see that coming. Why didn't she see it coming? Because she got paid generously. And she's got school loans.
She's in school, right? She's not making much
every
money.
dollar she gets. So we become blind when it comes to things like money, power, sex, influence, fame, all those kinds of things, right? So obviously she shouldn't do this. But think about this. Let's say she does it and nothing seems to happen. Nothing goes wrong. And then the mom and the daughter come back, and after a next counseling session, the mom comes up to Kendra and says, "Thank you so much. I don't know what we would have done without you. And by the way, now I've got my sister-in-law is a therapist, and I know you probably weren't supposed to do that because it's like a dual relationship or whatever. So I really appreciate you doing that and kind of going where you should go. By the way, I want to know what my daughter's telling you about me." Now, maybe I'm being overly cynical, but I've seen things like this happen. Some of you have too. So what you're doing, she's not realizing it. She is changing this power differential is going back and forth out of control. And so now the mom perhaps has some leverage over it. Or the mom could say, "I've got some jewelry that's missing."
Right.
Now you're going to tell me what my daughter is saying about her father or whatever?
Right.
No. She should never have gotten into this, but she was tempted by the money, perhaps. So that's not it. And there's going to be what? There's going to be policies here to look at as far as therapist issues. Well, in a strange way, she would benefit financially if she did take the job. I hope she didn't make the decision based on that. Legal issues, there's probably not any overt legal issues here. It's mainly multiple relationships, and multiple relationships go hand in hand so often with power differentials, boundaries, and guess what? Social media.
Sure.
Those four things. We'll talk about that in the ethics and technology training, which we're going to record here pretty soon, I think. So that's just, now you can dive deep into this. Let me make this one other point. With any of these vignettes, after you've worked through it, say you've got 3 or 4 of your colleagues and you've worked through it and you've discussed all the different perspectives and so forth, what would you do? Go back and change one of the variables.
I like
what do
that.
I mean by variables? Who's providing the services? Is there a supervisor? What kind of agency is it? What's the age of the daughter? We talk about that therapeutic issue with the daughter. Especially if she's young, her idea about what this relationship is with Kendra is all blurred now. Okay, maybe that's enough. I'm probably out of time. Did you have any questions about that, or questions about something else?
I think that's good. The thing that comes to my mind about it gets more and more complicated the more involved you get is at some point you may end up having to stop treatment then, and you get into abandonment issues.
Yes.
It's such a slippery slope, I think.
Yeah. Wait till the next training. There's a vignette. You're sensing what's coming, I think.
Right, sensing. I'd like to ask you a little bit about, I don't know if there's another vignette about
Sure.
reporting, mandatory reporting. You talk about the trailblazers, and
yeah. Well, that's just my way of thinking of it, is that sometimes people who push the limits and step over the line a little bit, they're out there. In hindsight, sometimes they were seen as trailblazers.
Right. I just wonder if you have kind of in mind an idea of people who do that reporting on a regular basis. I'm thinking of DCS workers who do it well, sort of traits of people who kind of, they know the ropes, and they know how to do it, and they know how to think through these things, and kind of just, they have some good strategies.
If you're one of like any of us, if you have expertise in one area at one time, you're very experienced at it, you get better. That's that so-called 10,000 hours,
right?
Thing. Right. So there's that, but most of us don't have that. In an area like mandatory reporting and state laws, and there's ethical issues, and there's clinical issues, and so forth. This is exactly why I would argue you need a model.
Yes.
So you can document how you arrived at your decision. And if you can demonstrate, I did this because it says this here and it says this here, and here was the situation, and this had priority, and I consulted with these 3 people, boom, 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 boom. Now, even if some governmental agency ultimately disagrees with what you did exactly, if you can point to and say, but here, this was my thinking, and if it's rational, reasonable thinking, I got to think the licensing board will take that into account in a positive way. So you don't have to be, we can't be experts in everything, but you need a model. And the more you practice it, like I said, the more you can think through it on your feet during these situations.
Right.
So that's where I would go with that. And when I do consultations, I encourage on the front end and the back end, get yourself a model, practice it, use it in supervision, use it in staff meetings, so everybody's kind of on the same page.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Good advice.
If we've got time, you tell me when our time's up.
You know what? I'm hoping Amanda is monitoring our time, because I haven't been.
Okay.
I think we have time for about 5 more minutes.
Perfect.
Thank you, 5 more minutes. Let's do this one.
Great.
I'm going to play it. That'll take about 2 minutes. We'll have 2 or 3 minutes to talk about it.
Okay.
Molly is licensed as an LPC MHSP temp. For the past year, Molly has been a counselor at Family Counseling Services in Littletown, Tennessee, where she works almost exclusively with children. Molly's current clinical supervisor is Elena Brady, PhD, LMFT, who also works at the same agency. The agency provides each counselor with their own separate page on the agency's website. Following the example of Dr. Brady, Molly decides to include some client endorsements of her services on her webpage. Making her choices carefully, she tactfully mentions to the parents of select current and past child clients that it would be helpful to have some testimonials from those who've had good experiences with her. Since she is the only therapist in the area who is competent to work with children with autism-related issues, she is especially hopeful that some of the parents of her autism spectrum clients will agree to provide testimonials. She believes that this will be helpful in growing her practice.
Okay, so the website part of this we'll address briefly in the other training because it's a technology kind of issue here. But you got several things going on. There's a supervision issue here. Yes, in Tennessee, an LMFT who has the right training credential can supervise LPCMHSP temp. That's okay. That's not necessarily a problem. But they have different codes of ethics, don't they? Yeah. So Dr. Brady here is going to have to be aware of both her code of ethics and the code of ethics for Molly. So something to think about. Well, it just so happens, unless the AAMFT has changed their code of ethics, there didn't used to be any prohibition against using against client testimonials. It's just not mentioned. So Dr. Brady may think, well, I can do this. This is fine, which is maybe arguable. But Molly follows Dr. Brady's example. Well, she's under a different code of ethics where it doesn't say you can't use testimonials. It says you can't solicit them. You can't solicit testimonials from clients or past clients. Why? Power differential. These are vulnerable individuals. They're undue influence is the term you'll see across codes of ethics. Undue influence comes into play here. Now, there's another thing here. If you're really reading this carefully, reading between the lines, this is a competency and supervision issue. She's the only one that works with autism-related issues, but she's supervised at the same practice by Dr. Brady. So the implication is Dr. Brady isn't competent in working with autism. Well, Molly needs a supplemental supervisor. That's the problem. She can't be doing this with a supervisor who doesn't have competency in that, but it happens all the time.
Sure.
One more thing I think will be done. Change this variable. Let's say that Dr. Brady is in a private practice. Dr. Brady, she doesn't work at the same agency. She's in her private practice down the street, across town. Now you've got what I call a supervision triangle, because you've got the supervisee who's working for an agency. The agency owns the records, but the supervisee is supervised by someone who doesn't have access to the records and can't see what she's documenting. Unless they make an arrangement like a BAA to do so.
Right.
Okay. And I will not be supervisor from private practice for someone who's working at an agency unless I have access to the records. Why? Because I'm liable. But it works the other way around. The agency has little control over what the supervisor is telling their counselor what they do with their clients. So it's a triangle. Mm-hmm. And that can get you in some pretty sticky situations if you don't think about that on the front end. So that's just another thing you can do with these vignettes. Like I say, change a variable and go through it again.
Yeah, that's nice.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
All right.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much.